Welcome to Imperial History, the podcast where we explore the epic stories of empires that shaped the world, from their triumphant rises to their dramatic falls. I'm your host, Eric Alexander. By the early 7th century, the Byzantine Empire was in a tailspin, a shadow of the Roman colossus it had once been. Picture it, a state that for centuries had stood as the unyielding bulwark of civilization, now gasping for breath under the weight of decades of infighting, economic disintegration, and external battering. This wasn't the empire of Augustus, Trajan, or even Constantine. No, this was a broken thing, listing in the storm. And then came the Sasanians, predators circling a wounded prey. At their helm was Khosrow II, a ruler who carried the grandiose title King of Kings and wielded power like a weapon forged in fire. Khosrow saw Byzantium not as an equal, but as an opportunity, an empire on its knees, ripe for conquest. His armies marched with ruthless efficiency, launching a series of campaigns that would shake the Byzantine world to its core. What made this invasion so devastating was not just the Sasanian military machine, but also the intrigue that accompanied it. Khosrow didn't just march in blind, he played the Game of Thrones like a master. He had Narses, a Byzantine general who had turned traitor, and Theodosius, a supposed son of the late Emperor Maurice, as his pawns. Together, they provided him with both the justification and the means to strike. The Sasanians swept through Mesopotamia and Armenia like a hot knife through butter. The Byzantines, reeling from years of internal decay, could barely muster a coherent defense. Enter Heraclius, the son of the exarch of North Africa, a man whose name would soon echo through history. But in 610, he wasn't yet a savior. He was a man on a mission, a figure stepping out of the shadows of obscurity into the blinding light of destiny. The empire was crumbling, and at its head was Phocas, a tyrant whose rule had become synonymous with corruption, cruelty, and incompetence. For the people of Constantinople, Phocas wasn't just a bad emperor, he was the embodiment of everything wrong with their world. Heraclius made his move, a bold gamble that reeked of desperation and ambition in equal measure. From the safety of North Africa, he gathered a small but determined force, boarded ships, and sailed for the empire's heart. And when they arrived at Constantinople, the walls didn't hold. The city fell, almost too easily, as if it had been waiting for a savior. Phocas was overthrown, dragged from his throne, and executed in the bloody fashion of the time. But this wasn't a happy ending. This was only the prelude. Heraclius was now emperor, but what he inherited wasn't an empire. It was a disaster. The Sasanians were still on the march, and the very fabric of Byzantine society was fraying. Heraclius had taken the throne, but could he save the empire? The storm had only just begun. By 613, Khosrow's gaze shifted to one of the Byzantine Empire's most vital cities, Antioch. But to call Antioch just a city would be a disservice to its legacy. This was no backwater settlement. Antioch was a linchpin. Strategically, it controlled the defense of Byzantine Syria. Economically, it was a powerhouse, sitting astride key trade routes connecting east and west. And culturally, it was a jewel of early Christianity, a place of immense religious significance. To lose Antioch wouldn't just be a blow, it would be a disaster. For Emperor Heraclius, who had only recently wrested the imperial throne from the disastrous reign of Phocas, this was a trial by fire. He entrusted the defense of this critical region to his cousin Nicetas and General Bonosus, bolstering their forces with reinforcements under Theodore, a skilled and seasoned officer. Facing them, however, were two of the Sasanian Empire's most formidable generals, Shahrbaraz and Shahin. These men weren't just battlefield commanders. They were executioners of Khosrow's grand design. They led disciplined, battle-hardened armies, equipped with elite heavy cavalry and expert siege engineers, soldiers who had already proven their mettle in earlier campaigns. The stage was set for a confrontation outside Antioch. The Byzantines needed a victory, a stand that would stem the tide of Sasanian aggression and buy the empire time. But their army was a shadow of its former self, a victim of the mismanagement and corruption that had festered under Phocas's rule. Supplies were scant, discipline shaky, and worst of all, unity among the commanders was lacking. Nicetas and Theodore were capable leaders, but coordination between the Byzantine forces was haphazard at best. In war, a divided command is often the death knell. Shahrbaraz was quick to seize on these weaknesses. With a ruthless efficiency that would become his hallmark, he orchestrated a well-coordinated assault. The Sasanian cavalry, masters of mobility and shock, outflanked the Byzantine positions, cutting off any hope of retreat. What followed wasn't just a defeat, it was a rout. Byzantine forces were slaughtered or scattered, their broken remnants fleeing in panic. Antioch, the great bastion of the east, lay defenseless. When the Sasanians entered the city, they made their intentions unmistakably clear. This wasn't a raid. In past centuries, the Persians had stormed Antioch, looted its treasures, enslaved its people, and left. But this time they stayed. Antioch wasn't just plundered, it was occupied. The city's treasures were seized, its inhabitants slaughtered or enslaved, and its great churches and monuments were razed. It wasn't just a loss of territory, it was the symbolic destruction of Byzantine dominance in the region. And the implications were even more profound. With Antioch in Sasanian hands, the Byzantine Empire was effectively severed in two. The Levant, and even more critically Egypt, the empire's breadbasket, were now isolated. This was no longer just a war of attrition, it was a death spiral. The empire's lifelines were being choked off, one by one. For Heraclius, the fall of Antioch was a bitter pill to swallow, a reminder that the fight for the empire's survival would demand something more, a transformation, a revolution in strategy, and perhaps a miracle. But for now, the Sasanians were in the driver's seat, and the Byzantine world was reeling. By 614, the Byzantine Empire's eastern provinces were bleeding out, and Khosrow II, the Sasanian king of kings, wasn't just twisting the knife, he was driving it deep. His forces, led by Shahrbaraz, set their sights on Jerusalem, the beating heart of Christendom. This wasn't just another city in the Sasanian juggernaut's path. Jerusalem was a symbol, a bastion of faith, and a cornerstone of Byzantine identity. Its fall would resonate far beyond the battlefield. It would strike at the soul of the empire. Shahrbaraz's army arrived outside the city with a force that could not be ignored. The Byzantine defenders, cobbled together in haste and poorly supplied, stood little chance against the disciplined and battle-hardened Sasanians. The siege was short, and with the city's fall came the ultimate prize, the true cross. For Christians, this wasn't just a relic, it was the relic, believed to be the very cross upon which Jesus Christ had been crucified. Its capture wasn't just a humiliation for the Byzantine Empire, it was a spiritual gut punch, a sign to many that divine favor had abandoned them. Imagine the impact of this moment. The Byzantine Empire had long wrapped itself in the cloak of divine legitimacy. The emperor wasn't just a ruler, he was God's chosen protector of Christendom. And now, the true cross, this sacred emblem of their faith, was paraded as a trophy, by their greatest enemy. To the Byzantine psyche, it wasn't just a relic that had been lost. It was a piece of their identity, their reason for being. It was a seismic event, a cultural and religious earthquake that sent shockwaves through the Byzantine world. But the fall of Jerusalem wasn't just a Sasanian triumph. It was also a story of betrayal and division. For years, the Byzantine Empire had ruled over its Jewish population with a heavy hand. Forced conversions, restrictions on religious practices, and waves of persecution had alienated Jewish communities across the empire. When Shabaraz marched on Jerusalem, many Jews saw him not as an invader, but as a liberator. And they didn't just stand by, they acted. Jewish fighters joined the Sasanian forces during the siege, their knowledge of the city and its weaknesses aiding in its swift capture. In the aftermath, the Sasanians made a calculated move. They allowed Jews to resettle in Jerusalem. For centuries, Byzantine policy had sought to erase Jewish presence from the city, but now the tables had turned. To the Sasanians, this wasn't just an act of generosity, it was pragmatism. By fostering goodwill with the Jewish population, they strengthened their grip on the newly conquered territory. By 618, the Byzantine Empire was staggering under the weight of repeated defeats, and the Sasanians delivered what might have been the knockout blow, the conquest of Egypt. This wasn't just another loss in a string of catastrophes. It was the kind of defeat that makes you wonder how Byzantium survived at all. Egypt wasn't just territory. It was the breadbasket of the empire, the economic engine that kept Constantinople fed, and the Byzantine military fighting. Losing it was like cutting the jugular vein of an empire already bleeding out. The Nile River Valley had been the lifeline of the Roman world for centuries, producing grain in abundance and generating immense revenue from trade and taxes. That grain fed the population of Constantinople, the beating heart of the empire, and filled the bellies of soldiers across the Byzantine world. Without Egypt, Byzantium was like a beast starved of its strength. Famine loomed over the capital, and the Byzantine treasury, already strained to the breaking point, had just lost one of its largest sources of income. It was an economic and logistical nightmare. The Sasanian campaign in Egypt, led by the ever-formidable general Shahrbaraz, was a study in efficiency. After their triumphs in Syria and the Levant, the Sasanian war machine rolled into Egypt with almost no meaningful resistance. The Byzantine forces stationed there were depleted and demoralized, their numbers thinned by years of endless war. But the Sasanians had another advantage beyond their military might, the discontent simmering within Egypt itself. For decades, Egypt had been a religious powder keg under Byzantine rule. The majority of Egyptians were Miaphysite Christians, adherents of a Christological doctrine deemed heretical by the Chalcedonian orthodoxy of Constantinople. The Byzantine emperors, ever eager to enforce religious unity, had persecuted the Miaphysites with vigor. Forced conversions, excommunications, and the imposition of Chalcedonian bishops had alienated much of the population. When the Sasanians marched in, they weren't just conquerors. They were seen by many Egyptians as liberators. Some even cooperated with the invaders, or at the very least stood aside as the Byzantine defences crumbled. By 618, the Sasanians had taken Alexandria, the crown jewel of Egypt. This was a city of immense significance, a hub of trade, culture, and administration. Its fall signalled the complete collapse of Byzantine control over Egypt. With the grain shipments cut off, Constantinople began to starve. The economy, already battered by war, spiralled further into crisis. Armies in the field faced severe shortages of supplies, further undermining their ability to defend what little remained of the empire. Strategically, the loss of Egypt was catastrophic. With the province in Sasanian hands, the Byzantine Empire's remaining territories in North Africa and the eastern Mediterranean became isolated and vulnerable. Egypt's fall wasn't just another setback. It was the moment the Byzantine Empire's survival teetered on the edge of impossibility. Heraclius wasn't just fighting a war anymore. He was fighting for the life of the empire itself. And with every passing year, it became harder to imagine how Byzantium could claw its way back from the abyss. The Sasanian juggernaut seemed unstoppable, and the Byzantine world was unraveling at the seams. But history has a way of twisting the plot, and Heraclius wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. By this point, it was almost miraculous that Heraclius had not been overthrown. Any other general with a shred of ambition might have seized the opportunity to remove him and take power, blaming Heraclius for the catastrophic losses under his reign. If that had happened, history might have remembered him as one of the worst emperors Rome had ever seen. Indeed, his first 8 years on the throne were marked by devastating defeats. The Byzantine Empire had lost Syria, the Levant, and Egypt, territories critical to its economy, security, and identity. The Persian advance under Khosrow II was unrelenting and multifaceted. While Shahrbaraz led devastating campaigns in the Levant and Egypt, his counterpart Shahin pushed deep into Anatolia. Shahin's forces sacked major cities, including Sardis and Ephesus, bringing the Persian threat dangerously close to the Aegean coast. For the Byzantine Empire, the situation was dire. Constantinople stood isolated, its lifelines severed, its treasury empty, and its prestige in tatters. The empire seemed on the verge of disintegration. Desperate to halt this spiral of defeat, Heraclius turned to diplomacy, hoping to buy time or broker peace. He sent envoys to Khosrow II, offering exceptionally generous terms. Historical accounts differ on exactly what was proposed, but the offers were remarkable in their scope. Some sources indicate that Heraclius was willing to cede the recently conquered eastern territories, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, effectively legitimizing Khosrow's conquests in exchange for peace. He also proposed to resume the financial subsidies to Persia that earlier Byzantine emperors had paid to maintain peace. Other accounts suggest an even more astonishing concession. Heraclius may have offered to abdicate the imperial throne altogether, allowing Khosrow to select his replacement, thereby reducing the Byzantine Empire to the status of a client state. These overtures, though humiliating, reflect the extreme desperation of the moment. Heraclius was prepared to sacrifice almost everything to save what remained of his empire. However, Khosrow II was impervious to negotiation. Flush with victory, he viewed Heraclius not as a partner for peace, but as a defeated adversary unworthy of respect. His response to the envoys was as scornful as it was ruthless. In his letter to Heraclius, Khosrow declared, "From Khosrow, the master and god of the whole world, to Heraclius, his vile and insensate slave. You say you trust in your God. Why then has he not delivered Jerusalem out of my hands? Why has he not saved Egypt? Instead of offering terms, bow down to me and beg for your life." Khosrow's disdain did not end there. He further declared, "That kingdom belongs to me, and I shall enthrone Maurice's son, Theodosius, as emperor. As for Heraclius, he went and took the rule without our order, and now offers us our own treasure as gifts. But I shall not stop until I have him in my hands." In a final act of brutality, Khosrow ordered the execution of Heraclius' envoys, a grim message to Constantinople that no peace would be forthcoming. For Khosrow, this was more than conquest. It was a deeply personal vendetta. He viewed himself as avenging the death of his former ally, Emperor Maurice, whom Heraclius's predecessor, Phocas, had brutally murdered. To Khosrow, Heraclius was not just an emperor to be defeated, but an illegitimate ruler whose humiliation would further vindicate his cause. This rejection forced Heraclius to confront a grim reality. Diplomacy had failed, and there was no possibility of peace. If the empire was to survive, it would have to fight, not defensively, but with the boldness of a desperate man willing to gamble everything. Fortunately for Heraclius, there was one key advantage working in his favor. Unlike the Roman army, which maintained professional standing forces year-round, the Persian military relied heavily on levies and aristocratic landowners. Once the campaigning season ended, these troops would return to their estates to oversee the harvest, leaving the Persian war machine temporarily weakened. These seasonal reprieves gave Heraclius precious time to regroup, plan, and prepare his counteroffensive. Let's take a moment to imagine what it must have felt like to be Heraclius at this point in time. The empire you've inherited is bleeding out from 1,000 wounds. Your armies, once the pride of Rome, are shadows of their former selves, demoralized, disorganized, and routed at every turn. The Persians are at your gates, and you don't even have the money to pay your soldiers. What Heraclius does next is bold, desperate, and honestly, a little audacious. He knows that the traditional Byzantine approach to war, throwing massive armies into the field, relying on sheer size to overwhelm the enemy, is no longer viable. That's the kind of thinking that worked when you had deep coffers and a functioning empire. But Heraclius is working with scraps here. So, he decides to flip the playbook. The Byzantine army under Heraclius starts to look a little different. He reorganizes it into smaller, tighter units that can move fast, adapt quickly, and strike hard in places where the Persians least expect it. This isn't the kind of lumbering force that could stand toe-to-toe in an open battle, but that's not the goal. Heraclius is thinking asymmetrically now. He's drilling his troops in guerrilla-style tactics, teaching them to fight in the rough terrains of Anatolia and the Levant, where they can exploit their mobility and terrain knowledge to outmaneuver the Persian juggernaut. But training and reorganizing an army doesn't come free. It costs money, a lot of money. And here's the thing, Heraclius doesn't have it. The imperial treasury? Empty. The empire's economy? Devastated. Most emperors in this position would throw up their hands. Not Heraclius. He looks at the situation and says, "All right, if we can't find the money, we'll make it." This is where things get really controversial. Heraclius does the unthinkable. He starts melting down church treasures. Think about what this means in a deeply religious society like Byzantium. These aren't just gold and silver objects, they're sacred. But Heraclius sees no alternative. He pulls wealth from the churches of Constantinople, taking items that had been revered for generations, chalices, crosses, icon frames, and turns them into coin. To the faithful, this could have been sacrilege. To Heraclius, it was survival. Now, if you're thinking this kind of move would have caused an outright revolt, you're not wrong to assume that. But Heraclius has an ace up his sleeve, Patriarch Sergius. Sergius isn't just a religious leader. He's a master propagandist and a true believer in the cause. Sergius doesn't frame this as plunder. He frames it as sacrifice. He tells the people that this isn't just about saving the empire. It's about saving Christendom itself. The rhetoric here is key. This isn't Heraclius stealing from the church. This is the church giving its treasure to defend the faith against the forces of darkness. And Sergius doesn't stop with words. He uses his influence to rally the clergy, the populace, and even the reluctant elites, creating a sense of shared purpose that holds the empire together through this extraordinary moment. In the end, it's a combination of military innovation, financial audacity, and religious propaganda that sets the stage for Heraclius' comeback. It's bold, it's risky, and it's not at all guaranteed to work. But at this point, what other choice does he have? Heraclius saw an opportunity in this despair. He wasn't just fighting a war against Khosrau and the Persians. He was crafting a narrative, a story that would give his people a reason to believe again. Heraclius framed this conflict as a holy war, a clash between the forces of Christianity and the forces of Zoroastrian Persia. And this wasn't just rhetoric. Heraclius didn't stay behind the walls of Constantinople, sending orders from a distance. He marched into battle carrying relics that were said to include fragments of the true cross itself. Now stop and think about that. Imagine being a soldier in Heraclius's army. You're cold, hungry, and tired. You've probably lost family to this war. But then you see your emperor, a man who by all rights should be hiding behind palace walls, walking among you, holding what you believe is a piece of the very cross on which Christ died for your sins. How does that affect your mindset, your morale? It doesn't just make this a battle. It makes it a crusade, a divinely sanctioned mission to reclaim what was stolen, not just from Byzantium, but from God himself. And Heraclius didn't stop there. He doubled down on the religious messaging through sermons, public rituals, and imperial decrees. Priests preached that the Persians were agents of darkness, standing in opposition to the light of Christ. Heraclius positioned himself as more than just an emperor. He became a defender of the faith, a soldier of God. This wasn't just propaganda. It was a full-scale mobilization of religious fervor, a way to unite a fractured and weary population under a single, sacred cause. And it worked. The people rallied. The soldiers rallied. Heraclius didn't just give them a reason to fight. He gave them a reason to believe that their fight mattered. This wasn't just about reclaiming land. It was about reclaiming their faith, their identity, and their place in the divine order of the universe. It was a gamble, and a bold one at that. But if Heraclius was going to save his empire, he needed more than swords and shields. He needed a cause. And what better cause than the salvation of Christendom itself? Now, here's where Heraclius flips the script. Up until this point, the Byzantines had been playing defense, reacting to the relentless Persian advance, trying to plug holes in a sinking ship. But Heraclius, he's done playing that game. He looks at the situation and decides that if the empire is going to survive, it can't just hold the line. It has to punch back. Hard. This is a huge departure from Byzantine military doctrine, which had traditionally been all about defense, preserving what you have, retreating behind fortified cities, and waiting for the enemy to overextend. But Heraclius realizes that this approach won't work anymore. Khosrau's army is too strong, too relentless, and the empire is running out of time. So Heraclius decides to take the fight to them. And not just in a small way. He's planning to strike right into the heart of the Sasanian Empire. Think about that for a second. This is a ruler whose empire is already on life support, and his solution is to go on the offensive. That takes a certain kind of audacity, but Heraclius knows he can't do it alone. If he's going to have any chance of success, he needs allies. And so, he turns to the Gokturks in the Caucasus. These are tough, nomadic warriors, steppe people with a long history of fighting anyone and everyone. Heraclius forges an alliance with them, offering the one thing that steppe peoples have always valued: spoils. The Khazars, a powerful Turkic group within the Gokturk Confederation, agree to join him, and their support is huge. These aren't just hired mercenaries. They're experienced fighters who can tip the scales in a campaign against Persia. Heraclius doesn't stop there. He's not just looking for allies outside the Persian Empire, he's looking for cracks within it. The Sasanian Empire, for all its power, is not monolithic. It's a sprawling state with its own internal divisions, disaffected nobles, ambitious generals, and oppressed minorities. Heraclius starts reaching out to these groups, planting seeds of rebellion, offering promises of freedom or favor. It's a classic divide-and-conquer strategy, and it shows just how far ahead Heraclius is thinking. Heraclius is laying the groundwork for one of the most dramatic comebacks in history. The stage is set. The empire is ready. What comes next is the stuff of legends, a counter-offensive so audacious, so high stakes, that it will define Heraclius's reign and reshape the course of the Byzantine Empire. It's no exaggeration to say that this is the moment where history hangs in the balance.